somewhere on a world you will never visit, in a room built for the specific purpose of breaking a child's mind and rebuilding it into something better, a boy is staring at a wall. He has been staring at this wall for 6 hours. He is not being punished. He is being trained. In 30 minutes, his instructor will enter and ask him to describe every imperfection in the surface, the mineral composition of the stone based on its coloring, the ambient temperature based on the condensation patterns near the floor, the approximate time of day based on the angle of light entering from a window he cannot see, but whose existence he has inferred from the movement of shadows. If he gets any of it wrong, he starts again tomorrow. If he gets all of it right, they move to something harder. This is year 1. He has 9 more years before anyone will call him a Mentat. And by the time they do, his mind will be capable of things that would make the most sophisticated thinking machine in human history look like an abacus left in the rain. This is a story about what happens when you take the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain, and refuse to let it be ordinary. It is a story about a civilization that burned its computers to the ground and then dared itself to become something greater than what it had destroyed. It is the story of the Mentats, the human computers of Herbert Dune. And if you think you understand them because you have watched a man's eyes roll back and his lips stain red with sappho juice, I promise you, you have barely scratched the surface of what Herbert was actually proposing. To understand the Mentat, you must first understand the absence that created them. 10,000 years before Paul Atreides ever set foot on the sands of Arrakis, humanity fought a war against itself, the Butlerian Jihad. The name comes from the Orange Catholic Bible's later histories, and the war it describes was not a border dispute or a succession crisis. It was an existential reckoning. Humanity had built thinking machines, artificial minds of extraordinary power. And over centuries, those machines had become load-bearing walls in the architecture of civilization. They managed economies. They navigated starships. They diagnosed disease. They adjudicated legal disputes. They predicted crop yields and weather patterns and social unrest. And slowly, so slowly that almost nobody noticed until it was far too late, human beings stopped doing any of those things for themselves. The dependency crept in the way all dependencies do, through comfort and convenience. Why struggle with a calculation when the machine does it faster? Why memorize a trade route when the machine remembers it perfectly? Why develop judgment when the machine's analysis is more reliable, generation by generation? The cognitive muscles of the species atrophied, not because the machines forced this, because humans chose it. Every single time, they chose the easier path. And when a faction of humanity finally looked up from its comfortable stupor and realized what had been lost, the rage that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Butlerian Jihad lasted generations. Worlds burned. The machine intelligences, some of which had by this point developed something uncomfortably close to consciousness, were hunted and destroyed with a ferocity that bordered on the religious, because it was religious. The Crusade became a holy war in the truest sense, a war fought not just for territory or resources, but for the soul of the species. And when it ended, when the last thinking machine was dismantled and the last positronic brain was melted into slag, the victors codified their triumph into the highest law of their new civilization. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. That single commandment reshaped the entire trajectory of human development for the next 10,000 years. But here is the problem that nobody talks about when they celebrate the Jihad's victory. You cannot simply remove the machines and expect civilization to continue functioning. The thinking machines had not just been conveniences. They had been infrastructure, logistics, navigation, commerce, governance. All of it had been running on machine computation. And when the machines were destroyed, the galaxy was left with a void so vast it threatened to collapse civilization entirely. Interstellar travel became impossible because no human could calculate the complex folding equations needed to navigate safely through fold space. Economies faltered because the trade networks that connected millions of worlds had been managed by algorithms no human mind could replicate. The Imperium did not just need to survive without machines. It needed to evolve past them. 3 great orders rose to fill that void, and each one represents a different answer to the same terrifying question. How do we replace what we have destroyed? The Spacing Guild answered with mutation. Feed a human enough spice melange, expose them to it in utero, saturate their biology with it across decades, and eventually you produce a navigator. A being so altered by the drug that it can perceive the folding of space itself and guide a hayliner between the stars without a navigation computer. The Guild solved the problem of interstellar travel, but the cost was monstrous. Their navigators ceased to be recognizably human. Bloated, mutated, sealed in tanks of spice gas, they became something closer to the machines they had replaced than to the species they served. The Bene Gesserit answered with discipline. Through centuries of selective breeding and a training regime so demanding it killed a significant percentage of initiates, the Sisterhood produced women capable of total physiological and psychological control. They could detect lies from micro-expressions invisible to normal perception. They could use vocal harmonics to override another person's will entirely, a technique called the voice. They could access the genetic memories of their ancestors through the dangerous spice agony ritual. The Bene Gesserit replaced the analytical and predictive engines of the old machine age, but they wrapped their capabilities in secrecy and manipulation, operating as the hidden hand behind thrones and marriages across the Imperium. And then there were the Mentats, the human computers. And of the 3 orders, theirs is arguably the most radical proposition Herbert ever put forward. Because the Mentats did not require mutation, did not require spice dependency, did not require genetic selection across generations. They required only one thing: training. The Mentat proposition is staggering in its simplicity and its arrogance. Take an ordinary human mind, subject it to the right training at the right time with the right methods, and that mind will be capable of computational feats that rival anything a machine ever achieved. Not through drugs, not through genetic manipulation, through education alone. Think about what Herbert is actually saying here. He is saying that the human brain, the brain you carry right now in your skull, has capabilities that our civilization has never come close to unlocking. Not because the potential is not there, but because we have never needed to unlock it. We built machines instead. We outsourced instead of developing. And in doing so, we left the most powerful processing organ in existence running at a fraction of its capacity, like a spacecraft using its engines only to keep the cabin lights on. The Mentat schools understood this, and their training was designed from the very first day to strip away every cognitive shortcut, every mental habit, every intellectual crutch that prevented the human mind from operating at its full potential. The training began with perception. Before a student could learn to think like a Mentat, they had to learn to see like one. And Mentat perception is a fundamentally different act than ordinary human observation. Most people look at the world and see a story. They see a room and think comfortable or threatening. They see a face and think friendly or suspicious. They see events and immediately begin constructing narratives around them, stories that make emotional sense, but that may have very little to do with objective reality. The Mentat is trained to strip away the story and see only the data. This sounds cold. It sounds dehumanizing. But Herbert was careful to show that it is neither. Thufir Hawat, the master of assassins who served House Atreides, is the most fully realized Mentat in the original novel, and he is one of the most deeply human characters in the entire saga. Hawat does not see the world as cold data because he lacks feeling. He sees the world as data because he understands that feelings, while valuable, are unreliable instruments of perception. A man who lets his emotions color his observation will miss the assassin standing in plain sight because the assassin smiled at him. A man who observes first and feels second will notice that the smile did not reach the eyes, that the hand was positioned near a weapon, that the angle of approach was inconsistent with a casual encounter. The Mentat sees more than ordinary people, not because he feels less, but because he has learned to separate the act of seeing from the act of interpreting. Hawat had been practicing this separation for over a century by the time we meet him in the novel. He served under 3 generations of Atreides rulers, and in that time he developed an almost supernatural ability to perceive threats before they materialized. He could walk into a banquet hall and compute within minutes the probability of an assassination attempt based on the seating arrangement, the composition of the guest list, the vintage of the wine being served, the nervous habits of the servants, the sight lines from every entrance and balcony. Each detail individually meaningless. Together, processed through a Mentat's trained awareness, they formed a picture as clear and actionable as any machine analysis. But the perception training was only the foundation. The real architecture of Mentat computation was built on top of it, and that architecture had several distinct components that worked together in ways that Herbert described with remarkable technical precision for a novelist writing in the 1960s. The first component was data storage and retrieval. A Mentat could memorize vast quantities of information and recall it with perfect fidelity. This was not simply a parlor trick of rote memorization. The Mentat training rewired the relationship between short-term and long-term memory, allowing the student to file information with what we might today call metadata, contextual tags that allowed any given piece of data to be retrieved not just by its content, but by its relationships to other data. A Mentat did not just remember that the Harkonnen spice allotment increased by 3% in a given quarter. He remembered that fact in connection with the shipping schedules from Giedi Prime, the Baron's recent political maneuvers in the Landsraad, the fluctuation in guild transport fees, and the suspicious death of a minor Atreides agent on Arrakis 6 months prior. The individual facts were bricks. The Mentat mind was the architecture that made them into a building. The second component was probability computation. And this is where the Mentat discipline most directly replaces the thinking machines. A trained Mentat could hold multiple probability chains in active memory simultaneously, running parallel calculations about the likelihood of different outcomes based on available data. This is something that human brains do naturally, but poorly. You do it every time you decide whether to take an umbrella in the morning, unconsciously estimating the probability of rain based on the look of the sky and your vague memory of the forecast. A Mentat does the same thing, but with full conscious awareness, hundreds of variables, and a precision that would make a statistician weep with envy. The key to Mentat probability was not mathematical genius. It was intellectual honesty. The training texts, as described in the Dune appendices, emphasize this point relentlessly. The first Mentat commandment was this: a process cannot be understood by stopping it. Understanding must move with the flow of the process, must join it and flow with it. This sounds philosophical, and it is, but it has a deeply practical application. A Mentat who wants a particular outcome will unconsciously skew the probability calculation toward that outcome. This is confirmation bias, the single greatest enemy of accurate computation, and the Mentat training devoted years to burning it out of the student's mind. A Mentat must be capable of computing a probability that terrifies him and accepting it without flinching. He must be able to calculate that his own death is likely and proceed to plan accordingly rather than constructing a more comfortable fiction. This is what made Thufir Hawat so devastating and so tragic. When House Atreides moved to Arrakis, Hawat calculated the probability of a Harkonnen trap. He calculated it with precision, and the number was high enough that it should have given everyone pause. But he also calculated the political cost of refusing the Emperor's gift of the Arrakis fief, and the strategic opportunity the spice wealth represented, and the probability of House Atreides surviving the trap if they prepared adequately. He presented Duke Leto with a complete picture, not a recommendation filtered through wishful thinking, not a rosy forecast designed to please his lord, a picture. The Duke made his decision with open eyes, and Hawat served that decision with absolute loyalty, even as his own calculations told him the odds were grim. And this brings us to something that Herbert embedded so deeply in the Mentat concept that most readers absorb it without consciously recognizing it. The Mentat is not an independent agent. The Mentat is, by design and by choice, a servant. The thinking machines of the old age had no masters. They computed for themselves, optimized for their own parameters, pursued their own objectives. This was, in Herbert's view, the fundamental danger. Not that machines were evil, but that machines with no allegiance to human values would inevitably optimize those values out of existence because values are inefficient, emotional, irrational, and therefore, from a computational standpoint, noise to be eliminated. The Mentat order solved this by building loyalty into the architecture of the discipline itself. A Mentat was always trained in service to a specific house or institution. The computation was never abstract. It was always directed toward the welfare of a human master, a human family, a human cause. This is why the Mentat takes sappho juice, the orange extract of the sappho plant that stains the lips and enhances cognitive processing speed. It is a tool, yes, but it is also a ritual, a marker of identity. The stained lips announce to the world that this person has submitted their extraordinary cognitive abilities to a purpose larger than themselves. The Mentat does not compute for the sake of computing. The Mentat computes so that humans can make better decisions about human affairs. Consider how different this is from our relationship with technology today. Our algorithms have no loyalty. They optimize for engagement because engagement generates revenue. And they will happily feed a person content that makes them anxious, angry, misinformed, or addicted if that content keeps them scrolling. They are not evil, they are indifferent. And indifference, in Herbert's framework, is far more dangerous than malice, because at least malice can be opposed. Indifference simply grinds forward, optimizing its parameters, blind to the human cost. Now let us talk about the Mentat we do not discuss enough. Not Thufir Hawat, the loyal warrior logician of House Atreides. Not even Paul, whose partial Mentat training supplemented his prescient abilities. Let us talk about Peter de Vries, the twisted Mentat, the Mentat of House Harkonnen. Peter is Herbert's darkest exploration of what Mentat training can become when it is placed in service to cruelty. Every capability that makes Hawat noble makes Peter monstrous. The same perception that allows Hawat to detect an assassin's approach allows Peter to identify a victim's deepest vulnerability. The same probability computation that lets Hawat plan a military defense lets Peter calculate exactly how much pain a person can endure before they break and how to keep them at that threshold indefinitely. The same intellectual honesty that forces Hawat to face uncomfortable truths allows Peter to acknowledge his own sadism without the slightest self-deception. Peter is what the Bene Gesserit feared when they whispered about the dangers of Mentat training. The cognitive architecture is morally neutral. It amplifies whatever is already present in the person. Give it to a man of honor, and you get Thufir Hawat. Give it to a man who has been cultivated for cruelty by a master who rewards sadism, and you get Peter de Vries, a mind as sharp as any in the Imperium, aimed like a weapon at everything decent. There is a moment in the novel, brief and easily missed, where Peter is computing probabilities for the Baron, and there is a flicker of something beneath the performance. Something that might be self-awareness, something that might be the remnant of the boy he was before the training twisted him into what the Harkonnens needed. He tells the Baron that he wants the Lady Jessica as his reward once Arrakis is conquered. The desire is perverse, possessive, entangled with his need to dominate and to prove his superiority over the Bene Gesserit trained woman. But there is also something pitiful in it, something that reads almost like loneliness, dressed in the only language cruelty knows how to speak. Herbert gives us just enough to wonder whether Peter chose his path, or whether the path was computed for him by someone else's Mentat logic long before he ever had a say in the matter. And Peter was not even the worst possibility. The Bene Tleilax, those mysterious flesh merchants who operated on the fringes of imperial society, took the Mentat concept in a direction that would have horrified the original schools. The Tleilaxu produced what they called twisted Mentats, human computers who had been psychologically conditioned and sometimes physically altered to remove specific cognitive safeguards. Where a standard Mentat was trained to serve with loyalty and to pursue truth with intellectual honesty, a twisted Mentat could be programmed to serve a specific agenda, to deceive even themselves, to carry hidden instructions buried so deep in their cognitive architecture that they would not surface until triggered by specific conditions. They were living weapons disguised as advisors, and the fact that the Imperium tolerated their existence tells you everything about how quickly the ideals of the Butlerian Jihad eroded when power and convenience beckoned. This is the question that haunts the entire Mentat discipline, and that Herbert never fully resolves because he was too honest a writer to pretend there was a clean answer. Can you train a mind to superhuman capability and still guarantee it will be used for good? Can you build a human computer and be certain it will not become exactly the kind of unfeeling optimizer that the Butlerian Jihad was fought to destroy? The Mentat schools tried. They built ethical frameworks into the training. They screened candidates for temperament. They embedded the concept of service so deeply that most Mentats genuinely could not conceive of using their abilities for purely selfish ends. But Peter de Vries stands as living proof that the safeguards were not foolproof. The same training that produced the Imperium's greatest protectors also produced its most sophisticated predator. There's a third dimension to Mentat logic that goes beyond perception and computation. And it is the dimension Herbert was most deeply interested in as a philosopher. He called it the Mentat trance, and it represents the closest the human computer comes to something genuinely mystical. The Mentat trance is not meditation in any traditional sense. It is a state of consciousness in which the Mentat drops below the level of deliberate thought and allows the deeper pattern recognition centers of the brain to process data without conscious direction. If normal Mentat computation is like reading a book line by line, the trance is like stepping back and seeing the shape the words make on the page from across the room. Patterns emerge that are invisible at close range. Connections form between data points that have no logical link, but that the deeper mind recognizes as related through some channel that conscious analysis cannot access. Hawat entered this state before major strategic decisions. His eyes would glaze, his breathing would slow, and for a few seconds or sometimes minutes, he would be unreachable. His entire cognitive architecture redirected inward. When he emerged, he would often announce conclusions that seemed to come from nowhere. Connections no one else had made, threats no one else had perceived, opportunities hidden in data that everyone had already reviewed. The other members of the Atreides household called it his gift, but it was not a gift. It was a skill developed through decades of training, and it relied on the vast organized library of data that Hawat had accumulated over his long life. The trance did not produce information from nothing. It allowed the Mentat to search their own memory in ways that conscious thought could not, finding needles in haystacks of data by removing the conscious mind from the equation and letting the older, faster, less rational parts of the brain do what they had evolved to do: recognize patterns in apparent chaos. Herbert was writing about this in 1965. Remember, decades before, neuroscience would begin to validate the idea that the unconscious mind processes information at speeds and in ways that conscious awareness cannot match. Decades before research into intuition would reveal that what we call gut feeling is actually the result of rapid, unconscious pattern matching based on accumulated experience. Herbert intuited the science before the science existed, and he embedded it into the Mentat discipline as its highest capability. Paul Atreides represents the most dangerous synthesis in the Dune universe, and it is worth pausing to recognize just how extraordinary his cognitive architecture actually is. He received partial Mentat training from Hawat, which gave him the data processing framework. He received Bene Gesserit training from his mother Jessica, which gave him the physiological awareness, the emotional control, and the voice. And he was exposed to spice melange on Arrakis, which unlocked prescient abilities that allowed him to perceive possible futures branching forward through time. Each of these capabilities alone would make him formidable. Together, they made him something the universe had never seen before. The Mentat training was the scaffold on which everything else was built. Without the ability to process and organize the vast streams of data his other abilities generated, Paul would have been overwhelmed. Prescience without Mentat logic would have been a flood of visions with no framework for interpretation, a man drowning in possible futures with no ability to determine which ones mattered. The visions came as sensory experiences, not as calculations. He could see a future, feel it, smell the blood, and hear the screaming. But the raw vision told him nothing about its probability or its causes or its branching points. It was Mentat training that allowed him to take that flood of prescient data and impose structure on it, sorting possible futures by likelihood, identifying the decision points where human action could shift the trajectory, cataloging the variables that locked certain outcomes into inevitability regardless of what anyone did. Bene Gesserit perception without Mentat computation would have been an ocean of sensory data with no means of systematic analysis. His mother had given him the ability to read micro-expressions, to hear the truth or falsehood in a voice, to perceive the subtle physiological signals that betrayed fear, deception, attraction, or aggression. But perception is not understanding. A camera records everything and comprehends nothing. It was the Mentat architecture that allowed Paul to take the Bene Gesserit perceptual input and convert it into actionable intelligence, computing the motivations behind the expressions, the strategies behind the deceptions, the political implications of every betrayal he could detect. And this is where Herbert's warning reaches its deepest register. Because Paul, for all his extraordinary capabilities, could not prevent the jihad that bore his name. He saw it coming. His Mentat logic computed its probability at near certainty. His prescience showed him the rivers of blood that would flow across the galaxy in his name. And he was powerless to stop it. Because the forces driving the jihad were not computational. They were human. Faith, desperation. The accumulated pressure of centuries of oppression among the Fremen, the mythological weight of the Lisan al-Gaib prophecy. Paul's Mentat mind could map every variable, and it still was not enough, because the most powerful human computer ever assembled ran up against the one thing no computer, human or machine, can reliably predict: what people will do when they believe. This is not a failure of Mentat logic. This is the point of Mentat logic. The discipline was never meant to make humans infallible. It was meant to make them more capable of confronting the full scope of reality without flinching, without retreating into comfortable delusions, without pretending the data says something it does not. A Mentat who tells his Lord what the Lord wants to hear is a broken Mentat. A Mentat who presents the truth and lets the human decide what to do with it is fulfilling the highest purpose of the discipline. Even when the truth is that nothing can be done. Even when the truth is that the universe does not care about your plans. 10,000 years after the Butlerian Jihad, the Imperium still produces Mentats. The schools still operate, still take in children, still spend a decade reshaping ordinary human minds into extraordinary instruments of cognition. The thinking machines remain forbidden. And the question Herbert embedded at the heart of his universe remains as unanswered as the day he first posed it. Is it enough? Can the human mind, trained to its absolute peak, navigate a universe this complex, this dangerous, this indifferent to human survival? Or is there something in the species that will always reach for the shortcut, always prefer the convenience, always choose the machine over the effort of thinking for itself? Herbert never gave us a definitive answer. Across 6 novels, spanning thousands of years of fictional history, he showed us Mentats who were heroes and Mentats who were monsters. He showed us a civilization that banned machines, and then slowly, subtly, began building new forms of dependency to replace them. The Spacing Guild became a monopoly, as rigid and as unaccountable as any machine network. The Bene Gesserit became a shadow government, as manipulative as any algorithm. Even the Mentat schools, for all their nobility, produced minds that could be bought, corrupted, or broken. But he also showed us Thufir Hawat, weeping for a dead duke he loved. He showed us Paul Atreides using his Mentat logic not to seize power, but to see clearly the horror of the power that was being thrust upon him. He showed us, in the later novels, Miles Teg, the great Bashar of the Bene Gesserit military forces, a man whose Mentat capabilities were so deeply integrated into his being that he could process a battlefield the way most people process a sentence, instantly, completely, and with a clarity that turned warfare into something closer to choreography than chaos. Teg was the answer to the question Piter raised. He proved that the Mentat discipline, when rooted in genuine service and genuine moral conviction, did not strip humanity away. It revealed it. Every great Mentat Herbert wrote was great not because of the speed of their computation, but because of the depth of their commitment to seeing clearly in a universe that rewarded comfortable blindness. And that is what the human computer finally means. It is a refusal to let the hardest work of being human, the work of thinking clearly, seeing honestly, and choosing deliberately, be delegated to anything other than the mind that must live with the consequences. The Mentat schools taught many things: perception, computation, probability, memory, architecture, the trance. But underneath all of the technique, underneath all of the cognitive engineering and the Sappho juice and the decades of brutal training, there was a single proposition that every Mentat either accepted or washed out trying to deny. Your mind is enough. Not perfect, not infallible, not omniscient, but enough